Dory probably gave you a copy of the PowerPoint when you came in, but if anyone needs an extra copy, just please go ahead and see Dory back there in the back. Again, I said I'm Marion Champion with Mission Springs. Dory Padee is back there in the back. I probably just butchered your last name, sorry, Dory. No. Dory works in the Public Affairs office with me, and she helped organize things today. We also have our engineering manager in the back, Eric Webb, our operations manager, Danny Friend, and then I also like to introduce our general manager, Brian Macy, who's going to give a little intro, and then we'll go into our presenter here tonight.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Marion. Again, my name is Brian Macy. This is deja vu all over again. If you have heard of Chrome 6, you may have seen it from the movie or in Rockfish. That sort of made it, that put it on the map, if you will, which required California to mandate testing, setting an MCL and things of that nature. But the MCL was actually established, and Chad will go through this at length back in 2014, and we were all rushing in the desert here to be compliant. We'll go over why it's important to the Coachella Valley and anything along the fault line and stuff like that. But this presentation tonight is not to say that we're not worried about all constituents or all contaminants. We're worried about all of them. You've heard of PFAS, you've heard of Chrome 6, you've heard of nitrate, you've heard of arsenic, all of those. Chrome 6, though, is the one of the four I just mentioned that actually going to impact our water quality here. We have no PFAS here because we don't have an Air Force base anywhere in our service area. That's where it comes from, or any industrial things like that. We don't have that. So PFAS, we're okay. Orange County, getting killed with PFAS, right? We don't have that issue here, but they don't have a fault line like we do, or they don't have Chrome 6. So from that perspective, we're getting hit by that. So take the good and the bad, right? And arsenic, nitrates, those types of things don't seem to be impacting our water quality as much as it does other places in the state of California. So that's why tonight we want to talk about Chrome 6. It's technically a new, or it's now being brought back, it's readopted as an MCL, and it is going to impact us. We wanted to bring our expert, Chad Sidel, who I've worked with for years. We were back in 2017, 2014, when we were dealing with Chrome 6 before, and he's working with all the other water agencies that are impacted with Chrome 6, whether CBWD, Indian Water Authority, or the city of Coachella. We're all working collaboratively together to solve this issue. So with that, Chad, please take it away.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks, folks, for joining in this community conversation. And I very much do want this to be a conversation. Pleased to be able to connect with you virtually. I wish I could be there in person. I should have brought my own refreshments into my desk for this. But welcome, questions, comments. Appreciate the fact that I can see you both from the front of the audience, and I also have the Facebook Live up, so I can see you from the back of the room too, just to know what's actually going on there. Joined by one of my colleagues, Blair Hansen, on the line as well, who's been working on our project to support the district in addressing and understanding how best to resolve chromium-6 conditions in the Mission Springs Water District water system. So let me put on screen the slide materials, and as you have questions, feel free to pose them as we go through. And if I miss a hand, feel free to just jump in and let me know to have folks join in. But I want to be able to step through an update on aspects associated with hexavalent chromium and just give you context for what it is that we're dealing with and how we're choosing to move forward in that. So as Brian mentioned, chromium is a naturally occurring compound that finds its way into drinking water for a lot of different reasons. It can be there because of its natural occurrence in the rock, in the groundwater. It can also be there as a man-made contaminant through industrial applications. It's important to note that chromium, when it's in water, can be one of two chemistry forms, trivalent or hexavalent. And it's really important to note those details because trivalent chromium, you can get that at the health food store. It is a known micronutrient. It's often found in dietary supplements, and there is an important amount of chromium that we need in an everyday diet. Hexavalent chromium, chromium-6, which is the exact same elemental aspect, it's just the reduction oxidation differences between these two things. Hexavalent chromium is known to be carcinogenic, especially via inhalation. So breathing it in is widely known to be carcinogenic, and most of that comes from, unfortunately, real-world history of occupational exposure. Folks that were working at facilities where there were literally vats of hot chromium baths, whether it was for plating or tanning or other industrial applications. Breathing in fumes associated with that led to lung cancer outcomes and obviously other cancerous outcomes beyond that. There have been a spectrum of opinions on the health impacts of chromium-6 via ingestion, and that is largely due to the fact that if you ingest hexavalent chromium, most human bodies have a high degree of reductive capacity, meaning they can convert that chromium-6 to chromium-3 just via the typical gastric system, which then means you end up with chromium-3 in your digestive system, which is then more in the micronutrient form than the carcinogenic form. Now, the challenge there is that we don't have a perfect answer to exactly how chromium-6 is reduced to chromium-3 in all people's bodies. And so I'll speak a little bit to why California is moving forward with this regulation the way they are, at least the way they framed it. So hexavalent chromium is often referred to as chromium-6, chrome-6, hexavalent chromium, hexchrome, the Aaron Brockovich chemical, all kinds of different things, but I'll just speak to it as chromium-6 in this conversation. And important to note that I'll use some technical terms like concentrations measured in micrograms per liter, or that's equivalent to parts per billion. I'll use those things in that way. And we'll keep that going. Let me get to the next slide. I will note, it looks like the live video changed or ended, but I'll keep the conversation going. Let me know if you want me to repeat anything. So in the Coachella Valley, hexavalent chromium in drinking water sources, groundwater sources, is widely known and understood. It's naturally occurring, and it's because hexavalent chromium or chromium in general is readily found in the subsurface. The geology and the hydrogeology of that area contains a lot of serpentine rock. And serpentine rock is known to contain pretty high concentrations of chromium makeup. Just the elemental makeup of that part of the Earth's crust has that, and happens to actually be the California state rock, and you have plenty of it in that neck of the woods. If you look at the map on the right, this shows increasing concentrations from blue to red, with once you get to about the green, yellow, orange, and then red concentrations, you have hexavalent chromium concentrations in water sources across the state. So anything that's not blue on that map, and if I put my cursor there, you might be able to note the Coachella Valley area has a lot of dots that have greater than blue, meaning likely greater than the newly finalized hexavalent chromium MCL of 10 micrograms per liter. But you're not alone. There are many other places across the state that have hexavalent chromium concentrations in excess of 10 micrograms per liter. There are certainly some in the LA basin. There are some in the southern parts of the Central Valley. Along the coast, we're doing work in and around the Monterey Bay area, have done a lot of work there over the last decade plus. Then further north and just west of Sacramento in the Dixon and further north to Willows area. And so there's reasons for this, and it all comes back to generally it's either the hydrogeology of how much serpentine rock is contributing to chromium concentrations from the groundwater, or in some cases, again, mostly in the LA area, San Fernando, Burbank, Glendale, there are some industrial contaminated sites that are known to have unfortunately been the receivers of waste discharges of hexavalent chromium that now are found in drinking water supplies or groundwater supplies. So the Coachella Valley, though, is by and large the most impacted, meaning there are more groundwater wells impacted in your neighborhood than there are in most other parts of the state. And so the action that the state is taking to limit hexavalent chromium in drinking water certainly has a big impact. Mission Springs Water District and many others of the neighboring water systems have work to do to address hexavalent chromium and reduce those concentrations through any number of means to comply. So let me give a little bit of history, and I'm only going to show on screen back to before 2011, but I will tell you, I first started my journey working on hexavalent chromium in California groundwater supplied drinking water systems in 2000. I ended up having it be the subject of my PhD research, which I started in 2001, 2002, finished that in 2006, published a dissertation and some papers, and was like, this is answering all the questions. Well, fast forward a good 25 years later, and now we're finally back to the point of having a finalized regulation to address this in California. So it's been a bit of a tortuous path getting to this location. I think it's really important to have transparent communication about why hexavalent chromium is being addressed the way that it is. So before 2011, it was important to note that hexavalent chromium was not specifically regulated in California or nationally. US EPA has had a long-standing MCL, or what we call a maximum contaminant level. So that's the highest allowable amount of a contaminant in drinking water. So for total chromium, which is the combination of chromium-6 and chromium-3, of 100 micrograms per liter, or parts per billion. California had a 50 microgram per liter MCL for total chromium. Now, actually, many years ago, both EPA and California had the same 50 microgram per liter MCL. The US EPA actually revised their MCL from 50 to 100 based upon increasing evidence about lesser concern about the public health impacts about total chromium. Now, this was decades ago, though, before some of the other research I'll talk with you about. Now, in 2011, California Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment, that's what the OEHHA stands for, or OEHA, as we like to give words to acronyms. They defined a public health goal of 0.02 micrograms per liter for chromium-6. That's very low. That's 20 parts per trillion. And that public health goal was based upon limiting carcinogenic effects of chromium-6 when ingesting it, by drinking it. Now, I'll speak to some of the questions about the public health aspects a little bit later, but just note that public health goal in California is unique. It is different than many other public health bodies across the country and around the world have determined. It is lower than anywhere else established, certainly not established in that way by US EPA and some other health agencies around the country and the world. But it is the approach that we have in California, and we want to be able to address it appropriately. So it took 3 years from then to implement a maximum contaminant level. The state issued an initial chromium-6 MCL of 10 micrograms per liter, went into effect July 1st of 2014. That required quarterly sampling of all the sources for that contaminant, and then compliance with running annual average concentrations, meaning you take a sample each quarter of the year, and once you have 4 quarters, you average those, and if they are greater than 10, you're out of compliance. If you're less than 10, you're in compliance. There's further details about rounding and all the things like that. But then the next quarter comes along, you take another sample. The previous first quarter falls off, and then you keep rolling those averages forward. We use that as a basis of compliance for lots of contaminants that don't have acute concerns, meaning, instantaneous concerns once you drink 1 glass of water, but rather drinking on the order of 2 liters of water every day of the year for your life. That's why we use long-term running annual average compliance calculations. Now, that MCL in 2014 followed the old approach that California had for new drinking water standards, which was it's implemented and it is immediately enforceable, meaning as soon as you take enough samples that you trigger non-compliance with the 10 microgram per liter standard, you're out of compliance. And that has just been the way that California has regulated contaminants historically, which then left any water utilities that had concentrations of the contaminant, in this case, hexavalent chromium, above those new regulations, immediately out of compliance, which can be difficult to communicate to customers simply because nothing's changed with the water supply. The water utility hasn't done anything different with their operations yet, but they simply haven't yet had time to implement the solution to achieve compliance with confidence that the MCL or the final rule is what they would expect it to be. So the year after that, in 2015, the Senate passed Bill 385 that afforded 5 years for water systems to do all the homework, the planning, the engineering, the design, the construction, the permitting, and then obviously the fundraising, increasing rates as need be in some cases, to be able to afford the improvements necessary to achieve those outcomes. So that was the path that everybody was on. We worked with helping a number of water systems across the state address that. Many in your neighboring communities were on the same path. And all of that was halted in 2017 when a lawsuit that had been brought against the state of California was upheld by the Superior Court of Sacramento that issued a judgment that invalidated that MCL. And what that meant was that as of September 11th of 2017, that MCL was no longer in effect. And it was because in the judge's determination that the state had failed to properly consider the economic feasibility to comply with the MCL. And they just said, state, go back to work, reestablish an MCL that would consider the economic feasibility. Now note, the judge didn't say that it was too expensive or not too expensive. They didn't say if the MCL was too high or too low, and they didn't say if the timeline was appropriate or not. They just simply said the California law requirement to consider economic feasibility had not been met. So for the last now 7 years, the state has been working to reassess and meaningfully answer the economic feasibility and has moved forward with how to do that. So in March of 22, the state put out an opportunity for public comment on an initial draft. This gave us a reissued draft of 10 micrograms per liter for a maximum contaminant level for hexavalent chromium. They, for the very first time, said that they would have a phased implementation approach based upon how big the water system was. Now, importantly, a few months after that, in 22, the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment, again, the folks that work at the state of California office that answer how concerning contaminants are in drinking water, they maintained the public health goal at the concentrations that they had established before, effectively stating that they were not going to take the path that some other state and international bodies have taken, demonstrating hexavalent chromium is less of a concern. And they wanted to maintain that, stating there wasn't enough evidence to warrant a change. Later that year, EPA suggested they're going to continue their review. They haven't finalized this still, but they expected to follow an approach similar to California. Now, fast forward to this last year in 2023, the state did more homework on their financial implications for the regulatory impact. And then finally, in June of 2023, a proposed rulemaking was issued with comment periods. Now, I'll say Mission Springs Water District has been active in sharing information with the state as they've developed this regulation, both about what it would mean for the community, what it would mean to respond to the community, what that would cost, and how they can effectively communicate it, and how long it would take. So when the final MCL was finally issued in April 17th of this year, the California State Water Resources Control Board unanimously 5-0 approved finalizing the 10 microgram per liter MCL for hexavalent chromium. And now we're in the more administrative steps of creating a final regulation. So the State Water Resources Control Board needs to file that rule package with the Office of Administrative Law. They've said they expect and intend to do so by the middle of June. And then that will be approved and filed with the Secretary of State. Once that's finalized, then it goes to the rule books and would be finalized and expected to be in effect October 1st of this year. Now, that effective date tips over a bunch of dominoes for monitoring and compliance schedules, depending upon that effective date. And so I'll speak about that effective date a little bit so you can understand, what does this mean for you as a customer of Mission Springs Water District or a neighboring community? What are the expectations we should hold ourselves to be able to take correct samples, communicate the results of those samples, communicate what we're doing to address those concerns, and ultimately achieve compliance with those rules. So And again, if there's questions, feel free to raise a hand or just note it and let me know. So I'm simply going to show on this next slide a slide that the California State Water Resources Control Board shared when they were issuing the final MCL. And it just reiterates there's several components to the regulation. There's the maximum contaminant level of 10 micrograms per liter. There's a method detection limit for purposes of reporting of 0.01 micrograms per liter. So that just says we have a standard we expect laboratories to meet to be able to detect these things at low enough concentrations that we can reliably know that the results are correct. Then there's methods that we use to analyze for it. There's 2 methods that are approvable. Then the state listed what are called best available technologies. So if you have to decrease concentrations of hexavalent chromium by removing them from the impacted water source, they've identified ion exchange, reduction coagulation filtration, and reverse osmosis as deemed best available technologies. So water systems that are impacted can choose to implement those technologies with not a complete green light to acceptance, but basically those technologies are known to be effective to reduce and remove hexavalent chromium concentrations and can be permitted for achieving compliance. Other technologies that can also be used can be considered, but they require more evidence and more testing to substantiate their effectiveness and approval, ultimately permitting approval by the state and the district engineering staff. Now, there's key details in this regulation that are really the first of their kind for the state of California about public notification and communicating results in consumer confidence reports. So the regulation requires water systems to get the word out about what we know about hexavalent chromium in the sources of supply. And then last, certainly not least, there's some details for both compliance plans and operations plans. All of this, of course, has to follow the other regulatory requirements like environmental impact reporting, and they have to then certify all these things to ensure that this time they don't fail to meet the test of any legal challenges. And because nobody wants further legal challenges to this. I think we all want what's in the best interest of the public health in this way. And more importantly, we don't want the uncertainty of taking action now only to have the conditions change in the future. All the communities impacted by that the last go around can speak to the challenges that led to. So I'll tell you what this means for you in Mission Springs with the compliance schedule. And again, this is the first time ever the state of California has had a compliance schedule. They are allowing water systems that have service connections of 10,000 or more 2 years after the effective date to achieve compliance. And they give 3 or 4 years for smaller water systems that serve fewer connections. The reason why that's important, again, is it takes time to go through the appropriate planning, engineering, design, really the fundraising and construction and startup to achieve this. And I know that Mission Springs is committed to doing what it takes to achieve compliance as quickly as possible. But as many of you all, I'm sure, have experienced over the last several years, especially in the wake of the pandemic, the amount of time it takes to source services and equipment to achieve anything takes longer. And so while we are all committed to doing this as fast as possible, we certainly have some concerns about whether or not we'll be able to meet the 2-year effective date. But more importantly, we're committed to communicating what it will take to achieve this so everybody's in the know about what's being done to address this. Now, a little bit of context. Again, California did not have compliance schedules before. And if this were not in place, like what's shown on screen, you would expect that Mission Springs would be out of compliance as soon as sometime next year, based on the compliance monitoring. But because this compliance schedule is in place, they have the opportunity to address compliance concerns, and we are hopeful we'll be able to achieve that with a number of approaches by October of 2026. Now, the monitoring schedule is important to note. With the effective date in October, that means water systems have to begin compliance monitoring within 6 months, certainly by or before April 1st of next year. and they have to take samples at all of the well sites that are operating. So all the groundwater wells that produce drinking water now have to be sampled at their entry point to the distribution system. And then those results are reported to the state. They'll be calculated on a running annual average basis to discern if they are in compliance or not in compliance. If they're not in compliance and the MCL is exceeded, within 30 days of that, they and every other water system that faces the same thing will have to issue what's called Tier 2 public notice for an MCL exceedance occurring prior to the compliance date. So right away, that'll have to be communicated. And we can already tell you effectively when that should be anticipated based upon the well's historical water quality conditions that we know. They've been mostly stable. There's some variability of concentrations going up and down in these groundwater wells, but by and large, we have some good sense of that. Now, 90 days after triggering an MCL exceedance, we'll have to submit what's called a compliance plan. And that simply is to tell the state Division of Drinking Water, or DDW, as well as the customers, consumers, what is the water system's plan to come into compliance? What are the water sources that are impacted? How much water do they produce? How can those concentrations be reduced either by not using those water sources or blending with other water sources or treating those water sources? And how does that move forward? Now, the year following exceeding an MCL, the consumer confidence report will have to include language about hexavalent chromium. And just by a show of hands, how many of you recognize what a consumer confidence report is? How many get it in the mail? You know where to find it on your water system website? I will tell you, the Consumer Confidence Report actually is a US EPA requirement, and they actually just finalized an update to the rule just last week. But this is the mechanism by which water systems are required to communicate to you as customers what is the water quality in the water served to you. So for the previous year, they have to provide a summary of the concentrations of regulated and some unregulated contaminants, and it is to be made available to you publicly at your home if you're a direct customer. And if you're not a direct customer, say you rent and the bill goes somewhere else, you can get it at the water utility, and you can also get it online. Now, the changes to the federal requirement now are leading to that, in some cases, being issued twice a year. But just know that if you have questions about what's in your water, it is a requirement to be shared. And I know that Mission Springs, as are all the other water utilities, they want to make that information available to you and answer questions so you know what that's like. Now, the last thing is,
before you move on, I just want to,
yeah,
we do have our our consumer confidence report, a copy of it for here. So for those of you that would like a copy of it, it is right there. The unique thing about it is it's dated 2022. The reason is because they are due out July 1st of the following year. So we are currently preparing our 2023 right now to actually distribute to the public for July 1 of this year for last year. So even though it says 2022, it is the most current one we have. It's also available on our website as well as past versions of it as well. Sorry, Chad, go ahead.
No, that's great context. Thanks for sharing that. It's something that you can find for every water utility across the state, frankly, across the country. I wish it were easier to be able to find it. You know, unfortunately, there's not an app that says, hey, show me what my water supplier is where I'm at right now. Those are efforts that are underway in states and federally right now to help improve upon that. But
we also send it to each of our customers as well. We turn it into so while there are minimum requirements about the consumer confidence report, we actually turn it into more of a newsletter. So you're capturing other things about the water district as well. So it's actually a newsletter that we and our board have chosen to send to everyone. So not only do you learn about your water, but you also learn about the district. Sorry, Chad, go ahead.
No, that's good. And again, the point here is to be transparent, and we welcome questions about your water supply. We live this each and every day. We know it takes a lot to maintain water systems and maintain water supply. So when you turn on the tap, whether it's to get a glass of water to drink or make some coffee or take a shower or wash clothes, that it's there. And that's a huge benefit to the community. And we welcome your questions so you can have an appreciation of what it takes to do that. So last we talked about operations plan. That just simply tells the state what we're doing to achieve compliance. So I'll just keep moving here. I won't read these to you, but I'll just let you know, this is the language that the state is expecting to be in the public notice and in the consumer confidence report. And it speaks to the sources of chromium ending up in drinking water, as well as the potential health effects. So you'll note the top right there, some people who drink water containing hexavalent chromium in excess of the MCL over many years may have an increased risk of getting cancer. And that's the driver for this action in the first place. And that's what will be communicated. And that's what we're working to mitigate and address. Let's see, I'll keep going here. Here's the timeline, what I said, and I won't go into all the details for you here, other than to say, Mission Springs Water District and many others that are impacted by this new regulation have a lot of work to do in the coming 2 years, particularly those that are larger water systems that have the 2026 deadline expectation. And so expect more communication, expect sharing information about what this water system is doing, what neighboring water systems are doing, and work to get to that point, and expect further communication even after that deadline as we work to resolve questions about startup and operations. This is a very common practice that we have in the drinking water community. As we encounter concerning contaminants, we work to figure out how best to address them, we regulate them, and then we implement solutions to overcome those. All right. So a little bit more specific about Mission Springs Water District. So here is a bar chart showing the chromium-6 concentrations on the left, ranging from 0 up to 25, but with the red line here at the final MCL concentration of 10 ppb or micrograms per liter. And this is all the well numbers. There's a number of different wells that supply groundwater, which is the primary source of supply to the district's distribution system. And there are just a few that have average chromium-6 concentrations since 2014 over the last 10 years that exceed the final MCL. There are several that don't. And so one of the ways that we're working to assess how this can be managed going forward is, well, let's increase production from those that are under the MCL and acceptable, and let's decrease production from those that are higher. It would be great if it were that simple. It's not quite that simple because we need to use the water supply where it's at. We can't let some people go without water. So there are some ways that we'll have to look at it a little bit more. Now, one more graph of the exact same information, just in a different format. So now we've got little tiny time series graphs with chromium-6 from 0 to 20 micrograms per liter, and then the dashed line at 10 micrograms per liter. And these just show you the samples that have been collected going back to 2014. And you'll note, again, those averages are pretty good indicators of what is historical. However, if you look at well 29, for example, here's this pane. I don't know if you can see that cursor or not. Hopefully you can. Most of the concentrations have been well above, but there was one that was low. And so we're investigating what leads to higher and lower concentrations, what can be done to lower those concentrations just with the well operation. And we're bringing all that information to bear with production information, like how much water do each of these produce to help inform the best solutions. All right. So what are the options to address chromium-6? So I mentioned that one example, well 29, happens to be one that has some of the higher concentrations above the MCL. And the primary options that we consider are non-treatment, first and foremost. Avoid using the source. Now, that's nice and easy, but that's like saying, say there's a new regulation for all cars to have 20 miles per gallon fuel efficiency on average. But you have a car that has 15 miles per gallon. What do you want to do? Just stop driving the car and park it in the garage? No, you want to figure out how can you improve it so you can keep using it. So abandoning a water source, while maybe an okay option for a while, you don't always want to leave the asset, that infrastructure that you as a community have invested in, sitting idle. But non-treatment is generally a low-cost option if you have other sources you can use, like If you got another car you could drive that has better efficiency, great, but then you still leave the other one parked in the garage. There are three primary treatment technologies: strong base anion exchange, weak base anion exchange, and reduction coagulation filtration. And rather than get into the joys of physics, chemistry, and engineering, I'll simply show some pictures in a little bit, but each one of these use unique chemical properties of chromium-6 to remove it from water and put it into another form. So either put it from a liquid into a solid, attach it to other things, kind of like the fridge filter you might have in your refrigerator, remove some things that might be coming through at that point. Each one of these use different chemistry or physical processes to remove chromium from the drinking water supply. Now, there are some other options, and you might have heard of these. You know, reverse osmosis, I said earlier, is a best available technology. There's other options like biological reduction, adsorbent or reductive media. Those are kind of like those fridge filters or Brita pitcher filters. Or conversion. You might have heard about stannous chloride as a way to convert chromium-6 to chromium-3. Those are other options that aren't as primary of consideration, but I will tell you, we don't leave any stones unturned when we look at options for water systems to comply, because we want to steward your resources as best we can to achieve the best public health outcomes with the resources you've got and minimize the costs. So the couple of pictures, and then we open it up for questions, and I welcome them anywhere in here as you wish. The options, as I went through those, I think I already did that. Here's just a brief slide to talk about groundwater non-treatment options. So here's a picture of a typical groundwater well. You know, that below this motor is a well casing that in your area goes down hundreds of feet to the point at which it is at the water level. And from that, it pumps water up that water column with operating that motor that's either up here, or sometimes there's a submersible motor that's all the way down in the well. And it pushes water out these wells and then or out the pipelines into the distribution system to the pumps in your street, ultimately to your homes and businesses. Right now, the only thing that's added to the water is chlorine, and it's used for disinfection to make sure we're protecting against microbial concerns. So the non-treatment options are really, you can abandon using that well. And that might be an okay option for a while, but if that well is in a place where it's a primary producer, like it supplies a lot of the water to your community, maybe all the time or at certain times of the year when you need water the most, it may not be possible. But I will tell you, we are looking at a number of ways to minimize production from some of the sources that have higher concentrations and increase production from other sources that have lower concentrations of chromium-6 to avoid treatment. There's also ways to modify the well. So if you can imagine, a groundwater well is a straw that goes deep into the ground. There's different parts of the groundwater that supply water to that well and then come up to the pipe that goes to your community. We find that in some groundwater systems, different strata or depths below the surface have different amounts of water that they contribute to the well, as well as concentrations of different contaminants. And so we always look to see, are there ways we could minimize zones that contribute where the chromium is coming from? Like some other contaminants, nitrate, for example, is most often only at the very shallowest, closest to the surface locations. And so if we can block those off, sometimes we can draw water from lower that is of better quality for nitrate. Unfortunately, then you usually end up getting other naturally occurring compounds like chromium. In other parts a little bit further west from where you're at, you can find fluoride or arsenic, or in some cases uranium, all of which we as water professionals are working to minimize those to maintain and protect public health for you all. Now, the last thing is blending. And, I showed those concentrations on the map or on the graphs before. There are some wells that have high concentrations, some that have low. And if you could mix those below and keep those concentrations below, you could make sure that everybody in the community is getting effective concentrations below the MCL, which would be a good outcome for everybody. So But that's a challenge too because of the infrastructure, because it requires more pipes and sometimes tanks to put those pieces together, but it can avoid treatment, which is generally more costly for the initial equipment and even more so for the ongoing operations and maintenance. So that's non-treatment. I'm just going to show pictures and talk a little bit about the two primary technologies that we believe will be most likely effective for Mission Springs. The first is reduction coagulation filtration, and I'm just going to talk to this picture. And this picture is somewhat near and dear to me because this represents the very first permanent full-scale operational reduction coagulation filtration facility. Happens to be in Los Lomas, California, just near the Monterey Bay coastline, near Moss Landing. And this is a very standard iron and manganese filtration system. These five tanks here are what was initially an iron and manganese filter system. And this water utility had already installed it to remove iron and manganese, but they didn't know at the time they had chromium-6 concentrations that would be of concern for the future MCL. So this was back 7-8 years ago. We figured out the chemistry to do some unusual things, both reduce chromium-6 to chromium-3 that is filterable and oxidize iron and manganese to those things that are filterable and simultaneously remove all three of those with this system. This had never been accomplished before. This is the first of its kind. And we were able to do it in a way that made the footprint of this equipment pretty small, because work that I'd been part of 15 years earlier in Glendale, California, required much bigger pieces of equipment, and we just hadn't yet learned the science and engineering necessary to make this work more efficiently. So I'll tell you, the reason why this process is likely to be very effective in Mission Springs is, one, now that we've made the footprint smaller, we think it could fit at some of the impacted well sites. If we have to put treatment there, hopefully we can avoid it. But it's not that different than just groundwater pumping right now. The groundwater can come up, add a ferrous iron, it reduces chromium-6. That iron then also is turned into iron particles, which capture the chromium-3, and they can be filtered out with a regular sand anthracite filter. And then those get backwashed, and that backwashed water then contains the chromium and the iron, and that can either be sent to the wastewater plant and those solids are captured there and addressed appropriately, or it can be addressed at the water treatment plant itself and be managed and redirected elsewhere and disposed of appropriately as a solid waste. The good thing about this for Mission Springs is it is pretty water efficient, doesn't waste very much water because, you know, water's pretty precious, don't want to lose any more drops than we've got. And it isn't as impacted by other things in the water as some of the other technologies. And that's relevant for the next technology I'll talk about. So the next one is strong base anion exchange. And on the left, we have regenerable. On the right, we have non-regenerable. And you'll look at this thinking, man, these just look like tanks that water goes through. And generally, all water treatment is just tanks that water goes through. It's just different stuff on the inside. I guess the photo that I had on the left, I should have picked up a headline for the left-hand picture happens to be in Soquel Creek Water District, where we helped lead the installation of this system. I will tell you, identical systems were also installed at Indio Water Authority, just south and east of you all. Those have also been in location there for quite some time. Also a success. And then the use case for strong base anion exchange that's regenerable is that the ion exchange resin, little polymeric beads, they exchange chloride for chromium-6. So for every chromium-6 that it removes, it releases a little bit of chloride, which is effectively the same as what you have with table salt. And then as it removes the chromium-6 onto those ion exchange resin beads, it fills up. And once it's filled up with chromium-6, you use a strong salt solution using effectively table salt as a high concentration and push that brine solution back through that treatment vessel. And that's what those vessels look like. And then all of the chromium comes off into that brine solution. Now that brine solution has all the chromium. At such high concentrations, it would be deemed a hazardous waste. So then it has to be dealt with as a liquid hazardous waste or further treated to become a solid waste, which in some cases can be deemed non-hazardous. Just complicated, has some costs associated with it. And I will tell you that we've seen good improvements in this process in the last 7-8 years since the early days of these implementations to help lower the cost, lower the operational complexity, and really make the water quality better. This is less likely to be effective in Mission Springs waters because of other things that's in the water that are of no problem for public health, but a problem that makes this less efficient. So one of those happens to be sulfate. The more sulfate you have in the water, the less effective this is to remove chromium. Now, on the right, exact same thing, except for you don't have the salt regeneration system. Instead, you just put new resin in there, use it till it fills up, and then once it's filled up, you dispose of it and put in new resin. Or there's maybe the possibility that there's some new businesses starting that will bring the salt regeneration to you, regenerate it, and take the hazardous waste away. All this to say, we're hard at work to assess what these options are, come to the best solutions for you and your community, keep the communication going about what these are going to be and what this will mean for you. How will this change what the water is at your house? Realistically speaking, you shouldn't notice a single thing once these things are implemented. But if there are any changes that you need to be made aware of, we'll make sure that you know those things. So finally, next steps, we're working hard to follow the regulatory process and all those outcomes. So that schedule I talked about, that's going to include monitoring for chromium and communicating those results to you publicly. There's a compliance plan that will be submitted to the state. And ultimately, we're implementing solutions to comply. This is what we need to do to achieve compliance, and that's our commitment to you and your community to do the best possible for you all. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that wasn't too deep into the weeds of drinking water techno speak, but welcome your questions and comments and appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, Chad. We do have questions. I do have a microphone, so I'll walk it around. You can ask questions either to Chad or Mission Spring Water District.
My question is that we're talking about starting compliance monitoring April 1st, 2025, and being in compliance by October 1st, 2026. But due to the data for well number 29, it's out of compliance now. It's been out of compliance for 10 years.
It's not out of compliance. There's no MCL.
Well, let's say
Don't be a
by the
smart
new
ass.
standard, it would be.
Excuse me?
We're
Don't
drinking
be a
this
smart
today.
ass. You're in
No.
our district.
No, I was just
We live
clarifying
here.
the
You deserve
position.
the respect that
No.
everybody in here deserves.
Right, I was just clarifying him because
Well,
what he
let's
stated
get-
was incorrect.
There is a compliance problem.
I have the right. The term out of compliance, rigorously legally applied, doesn't even exist until October 2026. But we are drinking it today.
Correct.
So why have we not done something about this sooner? That's my question. I haven't got to yet.
Chad, did you hear that? Or do you want?
I think I heard most of it. I didn't hear quite all of it. I guess the question, make sure I understand it, is why hasn't action been taken sooner or what could be done more quickly?
That's a good summary, yes.
Yes.
I will tell you, having been a part of assisting the state with its consideration of the MCL, doing the same with the EPA nationally, and obviously communities and water utilities across the country. First and foremost, there's been uncertainty as to whether or not the MCL is going to be finalized or not. And with the question that I can go back to the slide that talked about the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment. There were questions about whether or not they were going to be revisiting the public health goal based upon the outcomes of other national and international bodies that came to different conclusions about the health concerns associated with hexavalent chromium. So my recommendations to water utilities in the wake of that uncertainty was wait until it's certain, simply because water utilities have a high degree of things they're addressing to maintain your water supply each and every day. And I will tell you that investments water utilities are making to maintain and sustain water, to keep the water coming out of your tap each and every day, is of huge benefit to you. And it's not to say we don't want contaminants in our water. We don't. I don't want any of these contaminants in our water. But I do know that the cost it takes to address removing all contaminants is more than we likely want to pay in every one of those cases. If I go back to that same example of, it's not a public health example, but the fuel efficiency question is one that sometimes can be relatable, is I think we would all love if we had cars that had 30 miles per gallon efficiency, but we know that we have some that are less efficient than that, and we're working towards improving those. The question is, where do we put our dollars to get the greatest public health benefit for our communities? And so I think the appropriate response has been support the regulatory development efforts, provide comment on what is meaningful and important for public health protection, and keep communicating the results of what we know is in water. So if there are customers that have concerns about any contaminants in their water, that they can take action with their water supply at their homes appropriately. So in those cases, and so we want to keep down that path, keep sharing the information, and doing what's best with the resources that the water district has.
Yeah, we could, one of the treatment solutions that he proposed was reverse osmosis. And that would strip everything out. If you pick up a bottle of beer or a bottle of Pepsi or what have you, even some bottled water, you look on it, they talk about reverse osmosis. Well, that costs a lot of money, and we could do that, but it would increase the water rates 10, 20-fold. So we have to balance the cost of the water versus the regulatory environment. That's one of the reasons why that process that Chad went through, talked about all the different things they looked at, and then they looked at the cost. Because the state looks at costs when they set these MCLs and all of these contaminant limits. So that's one of the things that we have to balance as a water district, the cost of the water versus the treatment capabilities that we have. Another question.
This is kind of a simple question, but would it help if we put certain filters on our water? You know, on our faucets and things?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So the state in their issuing of the MCL did share information about what consumers can do to address concerns in their case. One of the things that's a little bit unique in this case is that the state of California MCL for hexavalent chromium is the first of its kind. There is not a federal MCL in this regard. And so there's not a national standard to test home treatment devices to certify them to meet this expectation. However, the state has provided some resources that will help you making decisions about what types of devices can help remove hexavalent chromium at your point of use, whether it's at the kitchen faucet or refrigerator or aspects like that.
And that was one of the things that CVWD looked at 5 or 6, 7 years ago, was point of use, because most people are concerned with the drinking water. So they were looking at doing it at their kitchen sink and possibly their bathrooms. But Chad, you can probably add to this. What they found is that it wasn't cost effective because you couldn't regulate it from that perspective. Because if somebody had it as a water district and that was your solution, now you're asking the customer to do it on a daily basis and they couldn't control that. So that may not guarantee compliance. Was that correct, Chad?
Yeah. So there's really two sides to that coin. The first is, consumers are always, you're at your choice to implement any aspects of addressing further water treatment in your home. Oftentimes people will choose to put a pitcher of water in their fridge just to make it colder. Same thing happens with that. Allows some of the chlorine to dissipate. So if you don't like the chlorine taste, you can put it in the fridge for a little bit of time. It'll help it dissipate. There are some places that have other objectionable odors to the water. Like there's a lot of surface water that has odor associated with it. No public health concern, just doesn't smell good. So people will address it that way. So customers can always choose to do those things on their own. But water systems, in order to comply with a regulation, they have to ensure that everybody in every connection can meet those expectations. So point of use treatment, which is what we call, implementing a treatment system at the sink or at a faucet or sometimes point of entry treatment, which is at the point where water enters your house, can be considered, but generally it's only economically feasible at very small system sizes. So in communities of more than 100 homes served or businesses served, it becomes too much of an administrative burden to be able to ensure every single one of those places is always in compliance. So that's the research that the state has conducted, and they've come to that conclusion. We do consider that in really small communities, but again, it's for a different objective. The larger systems is why we consider options at the water supply system scale. So everybody in all places gets that outcome.
Any other questions? I see a question, I think it's being developed. Yep.
Is there some sort of a map that shows which areas are fed by which well? And is there any like a lab or so that you can send a water sample to exactly know what's in your house before or after filters or something like that?
Chad, did you hear that?
I think I heard, is there a map or is there a way to get samples tested?
Yes, those were the two questions. The map answer is we know what we can, the maps for our wells, yes. What well serves your house is a little more difficult because you may be served by multiple wells. And also, especially when you get in the higher elevations, we fill reservoirs with various wells, and then we pump it up to the next reservoir and then to the next. So they're co-mingled almost immediately when you start going up the higher elevations.
So it is being blended.
So it is we're blended there. When he's talking about blending here, he's like, if you have two wells that are close and one high and one's low, your sampling point changes from when the water comes out of the ground to where it actually gets put into the system. So the blending is a little bit different than what we do talking in the overall system, if you will. Now, as far as sampling, were you talking about Babcock potentially or some other local laboratories, Chad?
Well, I mean, there are certainly a number of ways to have samples collected and analyzed. I know that there are some consumer-facing locations that allow folks to submit and get samples analyzed if that's of interest. But I think the more important details are just knowing where the water samples are collected at the sources, as we've shared, and can provide more details around that for the future monitoring that will be happening. So you can know what's going forward. Now keep in mind, the regulation that's in place now is intended to address concerns of exposure to hexavalent chromium from drinking it over a 70-year period. And so the goal is to decrease that exposure in the years to come. So no single result should be viewed as a public health concern. It's the long-term effects of that. And so we know that this is a change that we're all needing to make now, and we're working to make that change so the long-term exposure is reduced from the point it is right now.
Any other questions?
First, a comment generally. I appreciate our state because we lead the nation in watching over the health of its people. I remember growing up in the LA basin in the 60s, and you couldn't go outside because you're in the afternoon, your lungs would ache from all the smog. And we pushed the regulations to have catalytic converters and things of that sort. So I appreciate it. But I do have an observation and then my question. My observation is that the evidence that 10 is the number, I haven't seen the scientific reasons why 10. Why not 15? Why not 5? And the regulatory history that you gave us, it said that there's no comment on the health effects. So I'm not bashing the idea of getting it lower. I'm just saying that if the national standard is 100, we're going to go down to 10. We're just leading the way. So to talk about health benefits without any pockets of problems within our state, within our area, is really lacking the scientific evidence. My question is, you mentioned it a second ago, beer, bottled water, and other water that is consumed. I know water has been reverse osmosis, then it is clean, but not all bottled water is reverse osmosis. Is the state looking at non-reverse osmosis water? Because a lot of people drink bottled water.
Yeah, great comments and questions. I'll start with the why is the standard at 10 question. I chose to not go too far into that conversation in the slide materials, but frankly, I've been having that conversation for 20 plus years. I will, rather than get into the weeds, maybe just compare and contrast. So state of California, Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment has maintained their public health goal of 0.02 micrograms per liter of hexavalent chromium. Note that a public health goal is just that. It's just a goal. It's not expected to be attainable. It is equivalent to what the US EPA and most other international bodies set as in terms of a maximum contaminant level goal, where nationally EPA sets MCLGs or maximum contaminant level goals at 0 for carcinogens. So if California had used the national approach, they would have just simply set a goal at 0. Now, the difference between a goal of 0 and 0.02 micrograms per liter, you might think, well, what's the difference? The difference is you can divide numbers when using 0.02 as the denominator. You can't divide numbers with 0 because it's just, infinite. You can't make that happen. But at least it changes the perspective of the goal being low and we want to achieve the goal and balancing the cost it takes to achieve those goals. So let me shift to Health Canada. Health Canada's most recent review of the health implications of hexavalent chromium led them to establish a national standard of 50 micrograms per liter, utilizing the same underlying public health scientific evidence that OEHA has in California. Their toxicologists just simply disagree about the health implications. And this is not the only example of how California views these things as compared to others. So you live in California, you can choose to agree or disagree with that. I think, frankly, it's almost a moot point simply because the regulation is in place and we're going to work as best we can to meet those objectives as efficiently and effectively as possible. And others can debate the toxicology aspects outside of that and beyond that. Now, moving to the second question about bottled water and reverse osmosis, you're absolutely right. It is important to note that bottled water is less regulated than the water coming out of your taps. And there is no certainty that water in a bottle is of greater quality than what comes out of your taps. And I'll tell you, I've worked on water systems across the country and internationally, and other than these concentrations of hexavalent chromium that are above the new California standard, but within the federal standard, the water quality in your community is of great quality. And they're working hard to maintain it and to continue to supply it, keep the pipes from breaking, keep the pumps from failing, just keep the water on all the time. That's not as easy in a lot of other communities. So certainly applaud the great folks operationally keeping things going there. But reverse osmosis, while it can remove it, it's not the only way that it can be removed, but bottled water isn't always a guarantee that it will be better. And so that's, especially when you consider we deliver water to your home for pennies per thousands of gallons. Compare that to the cost of a case of water that you go buy from any of the big box stores. You pay a lot of extra for the convenience of having it already in a bottle when you can open up a tap and fill it up at your home. So I'm a big proponent of tap water, obviously. So I'll leave it at that.
Real quick and easy one, what is the water district doing to address this problem with the chromium?
So what are we doing to address chromium? Well, first of all, we have an expert, Chad Sidel. That's the first step, right? So we have him, and he is looking at all of our water quality data since 2014, some earlier, and many other tests we've completed. As he was talking about, there's other constituents in our water that may or may not allow us to do a certain part of treatment. That is a long-term solution. The short-term solution is, when you look at those wells, we have some wells that are under and a couple that are over. We have enough available capacity there's two wells on that table that are not shown that are going to be in operation probably by the end of this year. And those both have shown that they are below the 10. So from that perspective, we believe we can turn those wells on and then take 2 offline. So we're always going to be under the 10 at our sources. We are going to continue to work with Chad to see what treatment we can do at others, because we don't want to have stranded assets. We put that money into the ground, we put millions of dollars into our system, and just to walk away from that doesn't make financial sense. We always talk about the cost side of things, that's one of them. So from that perspective, we are looking at our well capacity and seeing if we can shut wells down, bring more wells on service, and then seeing what's cheap. One of the things he talked about, strong base ion exchange, that's something that I work on in India. It's very expensive. It's more expensive than the RCF, which is a little bit more cost effective. That may change some of our next philosophies moving forward, but day one, when the compliance window hits, we're going to make sure that we're compliant, and then we'll worry about how we bring the other ones back then. But we do have plans for that, and other wells that we can also rehab that still have useful life in them that are not online now, that will help us that way as well. So we've got several different plan A's, plan B's, and then a plan C, and then a future plan that Chad's gonna help us with as well.
Fantastic.
Before, I have a question.
Okay.
You list here 4 wells, a couple of them seem to be. I have, my information showing you, that you have as many as, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wells that were out of compliance as of 2020. And from testimony that you gave at a recent meeting, you know, tested, and then I understand you had a comment that you made to a director from another agency that you have tested. So there's a little inconsistency in the information that we're getting about our drinking water from Mission Springs Water District. It's my understanding that the state's 10 micron or 10 parts per billion will allow for a minimum of 10 to 15 people in desert hot springs to die as a result of chromium-6 in their drinking water. It's also clear that over the time that this has been talked about, this district has advocated for allowing as many as 250 of our citizens to die of chromium-6 before we step in and try to fix the problem. And it's been an ongoing, you know, somebody that's been following it from the very beginning. Pretty sure before we're at India Water Authority, I believe you live in India. When this problem reared its ugly head down there, you guys fixed it instantly. So because Desert Hot Springs hasn't had the kind of leadership that they had in India, we've been living with this for probably at 2016, they raised the rates by $20 million to fix this problem. I understand at your last board meeting, it was announced that you're gonna have to start borrowing money to pay your daily expenses. I don't know if that actually came to pass or not, but that's what was said.
I don't hear a question.
That was,
I hear lots of pontificating.
That's not
I don't hear a
pontification.
question from our GM.
but that's not true either. So.
You borrowed $15 million, you put it in the bank, you're calling it an asset, now you're having to take from that $15 million to pay your ongoing daily expenses.
Is that your question?
So my question is, what happened to that 20 million that was raised in 2016 to fix this problem? And why do you meet every month and talk about your new building, but don't talk about cleaning up our drinking water? That's my question.
Let me address the first issue about the borrowing of $15 million. The reason we borrowed for $15 million is very simple. We got $68 million from the state of California to build a wastewater treatment facility. Unfortunately, it takes the state about anywhere from a year to 18 months to pay us back. We didn't have the financial resources to build as much as we wanted to, as quickly as we wanted to make sure that we were compliant from a wastewater perspective. So we did have to borrow for cash flow purposes to make sure that we would get that. We actually just received a $9 million check earlier this week, going hand in hand with, we just needed the available cash flow because we just didn't have enough resources to cover a $68 million loan. That's the first thing.
When I was on your board, I was told that that was gonna be a free gift. We weren't gonna have to borrow any money, that money was all coming from the state.
So
Everything that was told, I made the motion to build that plant on information that was completely false.
Sir, can I
And
finish?
erroneous. And you know it, you were sitting in the room, and now you're guarding that decision.
No, it's just the cash flow. So that's the one thing, you don't rarely get a $60 million loan or grant from the state and have to work through those issues, nor do you have to wait 18 months to get paid back. So that's just one of the things that we had to do from that perspective. We have money in the bank from that perspective. We just didn't want to convert some of our long assets when we had to take a loss. So the second question was, I believe, what happened to the $20 million when we raised rates back in 2016? Well, one of them is going towards a brand new well. That brand new well is one of the ones I mentioned that can help us with capacity, which is lower than the 10 parts per billion. So some of that has actually gone to fixing the Chrome 6 issue, as well as rehabbing other wells that are also under. So it's not that we ignored the Chrome 6 and we told people that we did not have the ability to help with Chrome 6. We are actively still working with Chrome 6 and upgrading our system. Did we go through what was the best available technology in 16 into a strong baseline exchange like the city of Indio did? No, we did not. We were looking at well rehabilitation to make sure that we were under that, and we were spending our money and our resources in that fashion, and we continue to do so. So we have not lied to the public. We are very transparent.
You lied to the board, you lied to me, I was sitting there,
That is not true.
multiple occasions.
Well, that's your opinion, so
Thank
leave
God
it,
for
leave that
It's
at that.
not an
And
opinion.
before I close this, I do want to thank two of our board members for being here. Robert Griffith, our vice president, and Amber Duff, who is one of our directors as well. If you have any questions, please talk to them. We'd be more than willing to help you with any issues or questions you may have. So with that, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for staff for helping us, and thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, folks. Have a great evening.
Chad, thank you very much.
Indeed.
I'll
Take
see you
care.
On
Feel
email,
free to
thank
call
you.
me.
Thanks, Chad.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Yeah, it's a Sacramento tax